Far more than we think. Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 16. Going with the Flow. Surrender has negative connotations for most of us because it implies a mixture of giving in, weakness, cowardice and failure. Surrender means we can't cope and that we have to give up. Ever since playground wrestling matches and childhood war games, my opinion of surrender has been overwhelmingly negative. To surrender is to lose, and our competitive instincts do not like the idea of losing. We judge surrender in ourselves as something to be avoided, and we may perceive those who do surrender as lacking moral fibre or backbone. This is all unfortunate from a spiritual perspective, because surrender turns out to be a key ingredient for initiating growth. We're not talking about surrender to another ego, but surrender of our ego to the spirit within. And there's an overlap between acceptance and surrender, with acceptance often coming first, and then surrender following on logically once the full implication of acceptance sinks in. In order to completely surrender to any given circumstance, we must first realize that we can't change it. Once we see this, we come to accept it and can finally surrender to it. We do this knowing full well that any further resistance is pointless. Well, this was the process I went through in coming to terms with my addictions, with each phase taking longer than it needed to, but with me eventually getting there. As a result, I came to see that there was very little in the world that I can change other than myself. What started out for me as a reluctant surrender to my addictions became a willing surrender to the flow of life. It is so much more effective to tackle problems from a position of surrender than it is to continue a fight that we can never win. The difference seems subtle at first, but upon closer examination it becomes apparent that surrender involves going with the natural flow of things, whereas fighting and resisting means going against this flow. Using an obvious analogy, it's the same difference that we would experience when swimming in a river. We either go easily with the current or we try hard to oppose it by kicking out against the natural flow. The contrast here is not only in the different amounts of effort being expended, but also with the direction that we are travelling. Going with the flow is easier and gets us where we need to go, whereas resistance is much harder work and gets us nowhere. It's the ego that's trying so hard to swim upstream, whereas the real prize in life is in the other direction. The fact that we were conditioned in childhood to swim in one direction and have since spent our entire lives doing so makes it difficult for us to even consider the possibility that we might be mistaken. We don't even want to contemplate it, let alone actually turn around and swim the other way. Many people have their heads down and are swimming so hard that they may not even realize that they are in a river at all, let alone that another direction is possible. Sooner or later we will see that the river of life is forever moving in its own direction, and that surrender to the flow is the better option. And we can make this choice whenever we like, and once we do, life quickly begins to improve. Surrendering to the reality of life exactly as it is makes things easier and far more enjoyable. We can always choose to continue battling and doing what we are doing, but this makes less and less sense once we see how attractive the alternative is. Surrendering to the flow of life takes courage. It requires a leap of faith that things will turn out fine without us having to control and manipulate everything to our own advantage. The freedom and peace of mind that this brings is priceless and is a source of great strength. Surrender turns out to be strength rather than weakness. Imagined power over people, places and things is weakness disguised as strength. It is fear masquerading as control. True power lies within, but we can only access it through spiritual growth. Progress cannot be made until we relinquish the ego's grip on our apparent control of life and allow things to unfold naturally. We can only control ourselves, and surrender comes when we fully acknowledge that we have little or no control over anything else. We like to think that we are in control of our lives, but in reality, anything could happen at any moment that would completely change everything. We know this to be true because we've seen it happen to others. We know that completely unexpected events do occur. Surrender involves letting go of attachment to any particular outcome. Instead of trying to control the ride, we simply sit back and enjoy it. We can still make plans and be very active, but we are equally happy whether or not the plans come to fruition. We do our best and surrender the rest. We will see in a later chapter how letting go of desired outcomes actually increases the chances of them happening, but for now, the first step is surrender. We're not talking about pretend surrender, whilst we secretly hope something specific will happen. We are looking at complete and genuine surrender to whatever life may bring. We can appreciate the beauty and wonder of life without having to own it and control it. Attachment to anything will ultimately lead to disappointment and loss. When it comes to attachment, we find that less is more. The ego is constantly wanting and needing more and more, whereas the spirit is simply grateful for things just as they are. The miracle of surrender is that it brings peace of mind. Surrender gives us inner freedom from anything that may happen externally. Surrender suspends judgment and allows things to be exactly as they are. When we surrender, we let go of all mental and emotional resistance to what is. The precise moment of complete surrender to the totality of everything can mark the turning point in our lives and lead to a whole new experience of the world. Amazing things happen when we surrender. We can surrender to the past, to the present, and to the future, and each one brings precious gifts. Surrendering to the past involves letting go of all our baggage. Accepting the past is one thing, but to completely surrender to it is a further step towards inner peace. We will not find the light by searching in the darkness, and in a similar way, our constant revisiting of the past will not reveal helpful understanding. It may be interesting to find out why we are the way we are, but simple knowledge will not help us change our current or future experience. Tinkering with the ego will not bring about spiritual growth. Surrendering to spirit will change everything. Surrendering to the past allows it all to be exactly as it was without the need for remorse or judgment. Feelings of guilt and shame melt away, along with residual anger, and the resulting state of mind is one of serenity rather than resentment. Surrendering to the past means letting go of all fearful memories and retaining only thoughts of love. If we hold on to the past and allow our thoughts to follow familiar habits, we run the risk of turning every new situation into the same old painful drama. Surrender gives our minds the freedom to change our perceptions, and we know how powerful that can be. The world changes when we change our minds. Our capacity to change our minds is our most precious gift, and surrender will allow this gift to be unwrapped. Surrender to the present moment obviously brings us right into our current experience, but it also has other benefits. One of the great joys of surrender for me has been letting go of all negative thoughts about who I really am. Instead of judging myself, criticizing myself, nagging myself, and generally beating myself up, I now see and accept myself exactly as I am. My previous thoughts of inadequacy and low self-esteem have been replaced by surrender to the reality of being me. Judgment has been replaced by compassion. Fear has been replaced by love. I now care about myself in a way that hitherto has not been my experience. I'm not talking about self-love in a narcissistic or arrogant way, but simply an acceptance and appreciation of who I really am. I have my dark, egocentric side, but there is also the pure spiritual side of me that is full of joy, love, and compassion. I know which one I prefer. My spiritual side leads me to do esteemable things, and my self-esteem rises. It's a win-win way of life, but I must remain surrendered in order for it to continue. By surrendering to myself, I can be myself. I no longer need to try to be what others think I should be. It's not that I'm arrogant enough not to care what others think of me, but simply that what others think of me is their business and not relevant to my peace of mind. It's only when we become vulnerable through surrender that our true underlying invulnerability is revealed. Being comfortable in my own skin does not mean that everyone will like me, of course, but that is perfectly fine. Personal taste and freedom of choice is one of our most precious possessions, and I will certainly not be everyone's cup of tea. It's so much easier to enjoy living when we stop trying to please everyone by struggling to be something that we are not. The relief of surrendering to myself as I am has been a joyous experience. I'm far from perfect, but nobody actually ever said that I had to be. My spirit is perfect, but my ego is not, and I am simply a mixture of both. I will always be a mixture, but the bigger the proportion of spirit, the better my life becomes. And the more I surrender to the present moment, the more spiritual I become. Another benefit of surrender has been the gradual removal of self-imposed limitations. Access to internal resources of spiritual self-love has removed my fear of failure or of making mistakes. I now have no problem making mistakes, provided, of course, that I learn from them. As long as I don't continually repeat my mistakes and try to blame others for my failures, then all will be well. But one definition of insanity is the tendency to repeat the same mistakes over and over, but expect a different outcome. I've done this in the past, and generally I try to behave more sanely these days. Surrendering my fear and my self-imposed limitations makes for a more exciting and enjoyable life. Surrendering to the future is really about letting go of attachment to particular outcomes. Happiness comes not so much from being insulated from the problems of life, but from knowing deep down that we have the capabilities to deal with them. Nothing remains the same, and continual change is fundamental to the natural order of things. When we fully accept this and surrender to the future flow of life, we let go of fear. Worry and anxiety are replaced with the certain knowledge that we will survive and continue to thrive, whatever happens. This trust in future well-being is what is commonly described as faith, but the word itself has strong religious overtones that many find off-putting. My faith comes from the simple fact that I've surrendered my past, my present, and my future to the natural flow of life. I'm fully confident that this is the right thing to do, and I completely trust that my spirit will guide me to do what is best. I'm no longer trying to get somewhere, but rather have realized that I'm already there. I am in the river of life and going with the flow. It feels so much better to be floating along calmly rather than thrashing about trying to get goodness knows where. Surrender, as I've described it, sounds like a one-off exercise, but actually it's something that we have to do constantly. We may decide to go with the flow for a while, but as soon as something happens which we dislike, we tend to grab back the controls. This may be something big, where we think it's far better for us to handle it ourselves, or it may be something trivial, where we react without thinking. The truth is, we will always find it difficult to relinquish control whilst we retain attachment to what happens. Letting go of attachment is the key to surrender. This is difficult to do all of the time, but it gets easier with practice. A simple way to do this, for example, is to fully accept the weather conditions on any given day without wishing that they were different. This brings us more into line with the reality of life, rather than constantly resisting something that is clearly outside of our control. When we are fully surrendered, our minds are much quieter. We forget about the past, we stop worrying about the future, and we give up resistance to whatever is happening in the present moment. This mental rest is like nourishment for the soul, and it provides all sorts of benefits. Once we stop expending so much energy on resistance, we find that our feelings of alertness and enthusiasm increase. Once we accept ourselves fully, then we can spend our time doing healthy and constructive things that we want to do, rather than trudging through life doing what we think we're supposed to do. And we all know the difference between doing something for pleasure and doing something because we have to. Surrender enables us to focus on the things that please us. Once we start loving ourselves, we tend to stop poisoning our bodies and minds with junk. And all of these positive developments in our lives provide us with the energy and the mindset to be of service to the world rather than seeking to grab everything we can from it. Surrender generally only comes when we can't stand the pain anymore, or when we are backed into a corner and have no other choice. Well, this is what happened to me, but even then it took me a while to finally throw in the towel. Surrender for me seemed like the end of the world, but actually it turned out to be the beginning of a new life which is far, far better than the old one. If I had not surrendered, I would still be living in the pain that I had created. And just like the injured boxer who gets back into the ring time and time again, we continue to inflict pain and suffering on ourselves until we can take it no more. I couldn't see any upside in surrender, but now I see it was the most important and beneficial decision I've ever made. We can save ourselves from future unnecessary suffering by surrendering to the inevitability of life. The only ultimate and permanent relief from suffering comes through sustained connection to our own spirituality. To accept our spirituality and surrender to the spirit within is to gain access to the inner beauty and perfection of who we really are. Going with the flow is the efficient way to grow.